Welcome back to Monetizing Innovation, the show where we unlock the strategies, mindsets, and technologies powering breakthrough growth and value creation. I'm your host, John Holcomb, and today we are joined by a true industry transformer, Andrew Chrostowski. Andrew is a board leader, acclaimed speaker, and podcast host with decades of experience guiding organizations from startups to the Fortune 100. He's a passionate champion for operational excellence, digital transformation, and building cultures that thrive in the face of disruption. Today, Andrew will share insights on leading through complexity, creating value in a digital world, and preparing for the cyber challenges ahead. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. I'm really excited to have our discussion.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here with you.
We know, Andrew, you have such a huge background in terms of what you've done, and you've led organizations from the startups to the Fortune 500s. What are some of those biggest leadership challenges that you really learned about driving transformation across the different businesses and especially scales?
Sure. Well, I'll share with you first that, if there was a letter I could have written to myself, when I first started out my career professionally after college, it would have been, it's all about the people, stupid. Right. It took me years to understand all of the complexity with that. I started off as a regular officer in the United States Air Force. I was a distinguished grad in ROTC, so I went in with a regular commission. I was a research physicist doing command control, communications, and intelligence work. And when I got to Space Division, I was responsible for some space-based asset programs that were very complex, involved thousands of people, and very high-tech, situations and development processes that you measured, the decades-long kind of development. And I got pretty good at doing the things I needed to do as a program manager, and I began to get, dropped in to help turn around programs that were struggling, right? If there was a piece of the program that was not moving fast enough and risking the schedule, I was usually sent there to that subcontractor or whatever to try to assess what was going on. And when I first started that process, I really went in with the mindset, okay, what are the boundary conditions here as a physicist? What rules are we trying to bend nature's rules with, and how hard is this engineering? And what I quickly discovered was always people. It was simple, dynamic communication, values, coordination. And what I kind of condensed it down to three principles, which I have used in every business I have run since. It was this idea of like people first. They're the foundation of everything that the organization is trying to drive. And then it's about the systems that those people use to create their work product. Doesn't matter whether that's an ERP system, a paper workflow system, an AI system, doesn't matter. It's like what systems are involved and how do we take the variability out of those systems and make sure that those folks know how to do that. And then it was all about the discipline to actually use the systems that we put in place. And so once I recognized it was a people issue, that means, of course, it's a dynamic leadership issue. And that's really where my passion for becoming a student of leadership really grew and ultimately resulted in creating something called the Leadership Academy at Goodrich decades later. So we can talk about that when it comes, but it's all about the people, John, always about the people.
And I think that is so powerful. And I like how you even mentioned too, the leadership aspect of it too, right? It really is leadership, not managing, right? We manage systems, not necessarily manage people. It's really the leadership aspect. And when you look at that, what were some of the first things that really helped you start develop? I mean, you mentioned a little bit with the program management work, but how did that evolve then as you were moving forward?
It's a great question, John. I'll share a story with you from my first civilian role, which was in a small company that had about 75% of their sales with Ford Motor Company. Right? So these people were basically in aerospace, but mostly automotive, 75% with Ford, and they were about to be delisted as a qualified supplier. And so they were highly motivated to have me come in as the new quality manager and quality engineer and sort of fix the problem, right? Find out what was going on. And I remember taking the first process that had extremely low yield on this process. So it was a potentiometer that was utilized, and the yields were, in the order of like 10, 15%. So 90% scrap, right? And so I started with the first shift people and then the second shift people and asking questions. It was during the third shift when it was late at night, and there was this woman with big Harley tattoos on her stuff. She rode a big hog to work, And I was talking to her. I asked her, like, hey, what's happening here? You've been working on this. Tell me about it. And we talked for quite a while. And she reached into her toolbox and took out a little red notebook, and I'll never forget this. And she handed me the notebook. She goes, I've been tracking this for 20 years. She goes, no one ever listens to me. You're the first carpet dweller who's ever asked me my opinion. And I stopped and I said, carpet dweller? And she pointed to the ground and said, I work on concrete. You guys live in a carpet. And I was like, wow. I mean, because in the Air Force, military, you always go to the front to get information, right? That's what you're trained to do, ground truth. And so I was shocked this wasn't just standard approach. And while she hadn't identified in that book the right solution, she identified the variables that were causing the problem. I was able to do a designed DOE. We ran it, and within 2 iterations of that design experiment, we were getting 90% yield. Management was thrilled with me on that sort of thing. And I actually remember going to HR at that time and saying, hey, let's begin doing this kind of asking people to do a suggestion program, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll spare you the long story because it's a long one. But in the end, it took a couple of memos and a couple of trips to HR before I finally was sat down by the VP of HR. And she said to me, Andrew, she goes, don't send me any more memos. She goes, the problem with these kinds of suggestion programs are eventually they expect us to implement some of their ideas. Oof. And I went, yes. And she goes, do we understand each other? And I said, yes, we absolutely, completely understand each other today. So again, it's a people thing. And so, it just amazed me that the most fundamental things that you could do, which is talking to the people who are on the front line, doing the work, have insights into what the challenge. They may not be trained enough to know how to diagnose it or how to understand how complex variables, in a multivariate analysis work, but you can figure out that, hey, these things change the outputs. Let's figure out the right setting, and we were able to do that.
Yeah, and that's so powerful, right? Especially it's that power of team, right? The power of we, when you really can go and understand those are the folks that are seeing all the interactions every day, and your insight to bring her in, right, really changed the outcome.
And it helped me in every other interaction, again, because I was obviously aware that there is this perception, right? When people are in management, and the higher you go in management, the worse the problem becomes, right? You go from being a director to a VP, to a VP, to a president, to CEO. You have the same, it only gets worse, right? You have to be able to think about the folks who are really doing the work and how do you get ground truth the farther away you get from the front line. And it takes concerted action, right, to be able to reach those folks and to convince them that you mean what you say. And I'll share a quick anecdote with you, and then we can move on. But one of the things we talked about getting people buy-in. When I was with Schick Wilkinson Sword, which is at that time they were building about 2 billion razor blades a year, so making trying to get to a 6 Sigma quality. At the time, they were about 3 Sigma in their manufacturing. They were trying to improve it. That was my job as their global quality manager. And one of the processes I put in place was I told everyone on the floor who worked for me in quality, and quality did not have a great reputation at that period of time. In a lot of operations, if somebody wasn't really a good operator or not a good particular production manager, they maybe got moved into quality, right, where they could not be as troublesome. And so that wasn't always the top talent, wasn't the most respected talent in the organization. But I told all of them, it's like, look, you have my authority. And I told them exactly what I expected and how we work things. If there's a problem, take it, and you disagree with operations, take it to your supervisor. If they don't have an answer, go to your manager. If manager doesn't, go to your director, right? And ultimately up to me as a VP. And one day I was in a meeting with the president and all the other VPs, and a secretary comes in with a note and says that there's an operator on the floor. The headquarters and this particular facility were co-located. She wants to talk to you. So I immediately excused myself from the meeting, and I went down to the production floor. And here's this woman scared to death because she doesn't know me that well, right? And I said, hi, what's the problem? And she introduced herself and said, look, my supervisor's out today, sick, and the manager's at a supplier conference and this. And so you're the only one left. I said, okay, what's the problem? She explained the problem to me, and then I got the production manager and brought him over. And it's like he had overridden her, right? And just like keeping production running. And I said, she's telling me that these things are an issue, and I laid them out. Is it true? Talk to me about, what's going on. What are you measuring? What are you seeing? And as he went through it, I said, well, is that meeting specification? And the manager kind of like, no. I said, okay, it's not meeting specification. What should we do about it? I guess we should, quarantine the last couple hours of production and inspect it again and adjust the settings. I turned this to the quality supervisors on the floor. I said, Are you okay with that? And she goes, that's what I was trying to have happen. I said, great, we're all in agreement. Good job, both of you. And I left. That went around the world because this operation was in Europe, Latin America, Asia. That went around the world that, this is now, if you had your ducks in a row and you were asking a question, you transformed people's confidence. That woman was 10 feet tall when I walked off that production floor, and it made a huge difference, not only in morale, but it brought back this idea that if you're truly data-driven, right, and if you're focused on making a solution, not like just identifying a problem, but really saying, we're focused on fixing this, and you're collaborative, working across the organization, because it's always, operations, engineering, sales, marketing, somebody's involved with how these things came together. You can then get that, and that became another one of my axioms, right? We talk about people, systems, discipline. The other axioms were team-based, solution-oriented, and data-driven.
And I think that is so critical, right? Especially we can bring it back to the data. It's sort of that rigor of first principles, right? And, if we can apply that same rigor to operations and to also the market, it helps everybody get aligned and get on the same page.
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons that, I'm such a fan of Elon Musk, because he thinks about his operating system as one of going to first principles, right? Whether you're talking about SpaceX and rocketry, or you're talking about Starlink, or you're talking about Tesla, always going back to those fundamentals. And that becomes, when that becomes a truism, that your organization believes that that's what's motivating you, and they believe that that's where it's coming from, that you're centered on these yourself, right? Then you take fear out of the organization. And that's one of the most numbing, things that can happen in an organization when they're afraid to bring issues forward, right? You want everyone to be able to freely communicate, and they only do that if there's trust. That trust is established by saying, it's not opinion, it's data and facts. And when we had those things, everyone will listen.
No, I think that's so true. And you kind of already touched there with the example, but to maybe even go a little bit deeper, what are some of those cultural and operational shifts that you found really essential for creating that true agile, innovation-driven organization?
Yeah, I think it's so true. It's you have to create the conditions for success, right? That's one of the lessons one of my mentors told me many years ago, early in my career. It's like, no matter what's going on around you, you are responsible to create the conditions for your success. And one of the things that we were talking about, Schick Wilkinson Sword again, this is a global manufacturer, consumer products, fast-moving consumer products. And I was hired again to turn them into a Six Sigma manufacturer, which we did over the course of about 3 years, raising that level up and retrained all the engineers and got people working on how to see variation and control it, et cetera. But I told the president at the time, within a few weeks of being there, I said, this is how we're going to get where you want to go. But that's not your problem. Your problem is it takes you 4 years to create a new product, right? We could build a car in 4 years, right? And so as a fast follower, meaning that, you kind of watch what Gillette does and you do kind of the same thing, a little cheaper, slower, that's not a very good formula for success. And so I said, let me redevelop your new product development process for you. And the key was, again, creating a co-located team that now was made up of marketing and engineering and manufacturing and supply chain. So you had all those pieces together, right? And a project manager who would look at it. And now those folks would have a charter. And we literally created all this documentation that went from, the management board saying, okay, here's what we want to develop, a new women's razor system, a new men's system, whatever. And now it's like, okay, now it just went, here's your budget, smaller budget, go figure it out. That team would work together to evaluate and move very rapidly. They didn't need to go keep running things up and wait a week for a meeting with marketing because they sat there with them. And so you were able to compress timelines because people are together. They begin to see that when engineering is concerned about something, it's legitimate. When quality says, hey, that's not going to work, because you find out that, hey, some colorants, when you put them in plastic, act as contaminants and actually cause problems. Anyway, the point was that we did that co-located teams that were run by contracts. And so when they would come forward, we were able to compress that 4-year cycle and did essentially 3 $100 million brands in 4 years using that approach.
Yeah, and that's what an incredible transformation, right, for Schlick. And then also, I'm sure even the teams that were driving those developments also felt more empowerment because of the success.
Well, sure. It's because at that point in time, you're not a cog in this small wheel. You are really making decisions, right, and taking accountability for saying this is a better idea than that idea, and you have to have data to support it. And that was super good. And by the way, I've done that at every organization, whether it was in Goodrich or whether it was in Tyco. I was able to put these co-located teams to drive innovation. And the concept is basically this, John. Whenever you're in a large organization, right, there's some value engine that's running. There are processes that are grinding away, putting out the OI, putting out the profit, right, driving the sales day in and day out. You got to manage those. If you take your eyes off of that, right, bad things happen. You miss the quarter. Then you have this innovation piece. It's usually smaller. It's kind of betting on the future, and it's spinning very, very rapidly, okay? And you have to treat that differently than you treat the big value engine. And the problem with most big organizations, they take their best leader or one of their best leaders from the value engine who's used to process, discipline, risk reduction, and you put them in charge of this small team, and everything grinds to a halt. Innovation stops, right? On the opposite end, you take someone who's now succeeded in this process where they broke the rules, they tried new things, they move rapidly, they fail fast, learn, and you say, great, now we're going to put you in charge of this production process. If they follow that process, things are going to come off the rails quickly. So you have to learn that its leadership is situational to whether you're in that innovation engine or that value engine. And what we're trying to do, and what I've always tried to do with my organizations, is develop leaders who are fluent in both tautologies, right? So that they can create value in either environment and succeed. And that, I think, is truly powerful.
I think that's such a great example because I think a lot of what I've seen throughout innovation, like you said, is it is a special skill set, right? To be able to operate in both boats because they are slightly different sets of rules. No, actually not slightly, they're way different sets of rules. And you get a point, right, through that early scale that now or the early development that now you have to start putting it in the manufacturing organizations and systems. Do you have any examples that you could share on that side of helping folks get through that transition as well, kind of that development to commercial scale?
Well, I think in every case, right, where you start transitioning, I'll use an example, with Tyco, where I came in as one of the first executives that George Oliver, who was the CEO at the time, hired to do what I called a hot transition, taking a holding company into an operating company, into a technology company. And so Scott Safety was the company, and they were a very profitable part of the business. They've been around a long time, well-respected brand in the fire protection services. So think firefighters, their air packs, their masks, different kinds of air purification system in the industry, et cetera. It's something I knew nothing about in my experience in aerospace, automotive, fast-moving consumer products. So I literally went to Texas A&M and got trained as an interior firefighter when I took that job. And so I understood my customer. And I understood right away that, what we see on TV and movies, shockingly, is not how a real fire is. And so I took my experience as a physicist and had someone who had gone through the infrared school at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the Air Force and said, let's make an in-mask thermal imaging system so that instead of having to carry one person on the hose with a camera that can see into the dark, everybody can see. And we did that as a result of what I called technology summits. We brought all the people together to talk about that technology. And I invited all of Tyco, the entire organization. Nobody came except the Scott Safety people. And, we did this thing. And out of that came 2 brand new process and engagement. We got a $45 million vote of confidence from the board to go develop a new gas detection system. And we got this commitment to do the thermal imaging system for firefighters. So we set up teams that were literally co-located, took people out, gave them budgets, sets of rules, and said, okay, this is your space, decorate it however you want. Here's your budget. I don't care whether you put in a water cooler or a refrigerator or a couch, you do what you want, but you can't spend more than this. And they let that happen, and they begin to make decisions on their own, and you get that speed. But you have to keep in mind is that, and we were able to do that through that process in about 14 months, which is unheard of. But now you've got to make sure that as it's coming out of that process, that you can tick the boxes for going into production, meeting all the standards, being able to certify. And so it's that education process of people understanding how you make that transition from that fast-moving innovation, wheel to the production wheel. And that's really the heart of your show, which is all about, monetizing the innovation. It doesn't make money until you escape pilot purgatory and you're in production.
And that's a great way to describe it, right? The pilot purgatory. When I think about that too, one of the things that is so powerful And I think you've highlighted it in all of your examples so far, is it really is that small cross-functional team and everybody getting that exposure to the customer, as well as then what it means to the operation. It allows for that cross-pollination to really happen and folks actually start advocating for each other at that point.
They really do. And a small team like that, if an engineer in that business might never have sat down and had one-on-one conversation with a customer, right? They might have not in the consumer business been there with the marketing person listening to the panel discussions of when you bring all the consumers and they talk about things. Well, now when they begin to do that, they understand marketing is a real function and it is the primary function of any business, right? To create new sales. And they begin to respect that instead of just thinking these are the guys that change the logo and the colors of the packaging and cause me headaches, right? They begin to understand what they're doing. And marketing begins to understand that, quality and operations and supply chain matter if you want to get this thing to market. And so as they begin to understand these cross problems, you're then able, right, to be able to work together to drive something. And I'll share one story out of this because I think it's illustrative about people getting buy-in. We did what we called quality functional deployment, right, where you come together and you look at every process in the product of its production and you rate what could happen, what could go wrong, right? And once you identify what could go wrong, you say, well, is it a critical function? Is it something that's going to stop the product from working or make it unsafe? Is it something that's just going to be expensive and not, satisfy the customer? Or is it kind of, not desirable, but no big deal? When we started production of this one system, I got horrified reports back that the logo on the razor handle was falling off in the packaging. Okay. And we're like, how could this possibly have happened? So we went down and we pulled the quality function deployment stuff from that and we looked at it all. And marketing had decided that, that's an engineering thing. I don't need to be involved. And so when this room of engineers and supply chain people and project managers got to the point that said, when we apply the logo to the handle, and everybody said, well, what could go wrong? What could come off? Well, is that a safety problem? No, razor works fine. Is it an operational? No, it's not that. Is it satisfying? No, I think the customer still be happy with the shave. It doesn't affect the shave at all. So it's not desirable, no big deal. Well, of course, that's like saying when you buy your $120,000 Mercedes and the little logo is like falling off the bonnet of your car, they think that's a problem. Well, obviously was. And so that really cemented the idea that this cross-functional activity is necessary. You can't neglect it, right? It really is, all the functions having to look at what's happening in a process if you want to go from ideation into production smoothly.
I'm sure marketing didn't miss many meetings after that. No, and I think that's so important. And that kind of leads into, right, of, fostering that culture where you're really trying to create the autonomy, right, for those teams. Can you share a little bit more about some of the work you've done and that? I mean, some of your examples have already illustrated that, but how have you done that across the highly regulated sectors, for instance?
Yeah, well, I think, I've had to deal with, good manufacturing practices for cosmetic products. We've had aerospace, FAA requirements. We've had military mil-spec requirements, right? So there's always things that you have to work through there. But I'll tell you that the number one variable, right, that every executive should understand is that change moves through an organization at the speed of trust. All right, and I got this expression from a colleague of mine, and I've never let it go after hearing it, right? Because it explains so much that you really do have to have trust in the organization to question, to understand that these are valuable things that we're doing. And if you do that and you get the co-located teams, then you begin to build the trust, you build the vernacular around how to describe what's happened. You get a focus on process and reducing variability. You start speaking the language of Six Sigma quality when it comes to processes that run without variation, that products that delight the customer, and go beyond what they're wanting. So that's something I think that's really important. And I'll say that, frankly, without that, nothing else really matters, because people will, you'll think that you've got something in the boardroom or in the executive suite, you're talking about this being implemented on the shop floor. You're that woman who's been doing it for 20 years, who's no one's ever really talked to, going, yeah, no one told me about this, so I don't care, right? and that's really what it boils down to. You've got to have that trust.
And it's so true, right? With that trust, you can get the buy-in. You get the 110%, not the 60%. I think that's a great example.
I actually have a One of my HR partners who I love, she was fantastic when I was working at Data Products. And I whole nother story really about starting my day when the factory had been destroyed by an earthquake, okay, on the first day of the Northridge earthquake. But this woman who we did a lot of great work with, she gave me a cartoon that I framed and I kept it in my office for until I retired. And it shows an executive sitting there saying, I need 110% from everyone, right? And the woman in the background's got the thought bubble going, I wonder what the severance plan is like. Yeah. So it's like, it's easy to say things like that. We often adopt it, but really, it's not a sprint. It's a marathon. You've got to get people to understand that, working harder. You never want to mistake activity for progress, right? There are organizations that I've worked in where frenetic activity was seen as like you're a firefighter, and not in the sense of like a real firefighter, but they have this analogy, right? Everyone's doing this stuff, and what happens when you're an organization that rewards people who are firefighters? You get more fires, right? And you've got to stop that and start saying, no, we want to promote people who don't have those because they thought through the process and there is no fire. That's the person you want in charge. And so you begin to build that culture of promoting the people who think about these things in advance and squash, that every time there's a firefighter response, it means that there was a failure in the process, right? And not a heroic reward something, reward the person who solves a problem for sure. But really it's about preventing that problem. And I actually created a whole rule of 5 that I used in all my businesses to help people understand how to do that.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful too, because it is, across multiple organizations, you can see that, right? If you start rewarding the firefighters, then you do. That's the culture you get. And it can actually make things tougher to actually then bring in strong processes, right, to help drive.
Oh, yeah. Your strong process person will be looked at as a cancer, right? The first time I tried to implement, a lean process, right, and I was trying to go through this, my naivety was that, well, I'm going to introduce this new, clearly better way of doing things, right? And it will be like as this little cell begins to just hum beautifully, it's now going to move out in the rest of the factory, and it'll be like this biological model where, the better way of doing things just spreads throughout the organization as we built this island of excellence, right? Well, the reality is the biological model is correct. That's exactly what happens. But the new thing is perceived as an infection by the body, and all the antibodies, move against it to like kill it because it's not part of what we really do. And so you have to really rethink how, change management is done and what's in it for me and how you begin to do it in a way that is not rejected, by the organization, but is adopted and celebrated, right? And again, it starts with people understanding the mission and what they're about and how you're going to go about doing these things.
No, that's so powerful. When you look ahead too with some of the just the challenges, right? We see a lot of different emerging trends and disruptive forces. How do you see that playing out in the kind of the near and long-term future? And how do we as leaders need to adjust to that?
Yeah, I think when we talk technology today, right, most of us are thinking about one of 3 things that are going on. We're thinking about AI, right, these large language models, these agentic process controls. We're thinking about large, machine learning implementations that are making things happen. We're thinking about edge compute, right? The chips just getting more and more powerful. We've got a supercomputer in our pocket now called an iPhone or an Android phone. And then you've got this ubiquitous connectivity, right? We're getting to the point now with low Earth orbit satellites that literally, your cell phone can be connected. You see it on Super Bowl ads now, right? Can you believe where I'm at, right? And people are talking in the middle of nowhere. So those 3 technologies are converging in a very big way. But the problem is that with most companies, and I do this at the board level, right, on the boards I serve, right? You begin to think about, it's not about, how can I use AI in my company, right? A lot of conversations might begin with, hey, how can we, I just saw this, how do we use that? It's the wrong approach. The first thing is to ask, what are the things that create value in our particular business? Okay, now how can we use AI or machine learning or ubiquitous connectivity or edge compute devices to improve that process to do something better and create value? And that's the right question. And so I think most mistakes happen especially in these rapid changes and in introductions of technology. We get all excited about the shiny object we go start chasing and stop asking the deep philosophical, the deep, value-driven questions. And as a leader, the most important thing you can inculcate in your team, especially the people who report to you, right, and who report to them, is asking deep, important questions, right? That valuing those good questions more than the smart answers. And by the way, in today's chat GPT world, right, an answer is pretty cheap. You can get somebody who's like whipping it off while they're looking on their phone as they're talking to you. So it's not the answer that's important. It's the right question. And I think about this analogy from Plato's allegory of the cave. Have you heard about that?
Yes.
Remember that from college or whatever?
Yeah.
This idea that man is sitting in this cave with a fire behind them, right? And he's looking in the cave at night and he's seeing the shadows playing out on the cave wall. And you're trying to discern the reality of the world from these shadows that you're seeing and not understanding that the reality is behind you, right? It's an interesting allegory that goes deep into human nature. But what I like about it, right, is it focuses on don't take the superficial answers, right? Look for truth. And truth, this is something, there was a great dialogue on LinkedIn recently talking about truth. One of my friends, Jeffrey Moore, had a great post on it, looking at what is truth. And the answer I love that I came up with and kind of really enjoyed because I was working with Grok, the AI system, is that truth is whatever you would still be forced to believe if every source of error and self-deception and wishful thinking were removed and reality kept punching in the face with ever better measurements. That's the truth. And that's where you got to start. Great questions and an acceptance of the truth.
Yeah, I think that is so insightful for folks, right? And I think, to your point, those questions that experience the knowledge of asking these right questions, AI is a tool for us. It's not the solution. And I think I really like how you described that. I think that's a great analogy. One of the things as I think through is, just this great conversation we've been having, is there anything that we've discussed so far that we haven't asked about that you'd like to share and make sure that the audience hears?
Well, I think looking ahead, right, and looking at all the disruptive forces that are going on that I get very excited about. I think the one that I talk about a lot, and I talk about on my podcast, the Connected Workers podcast that you can see on Apple or Spotify or at OGGN. I'm sure you'll put those links in the show notes or wherever for us, John. But to me, it's this idea that these technologies are going to affect the blue collar, what I call a blue collar renaissance. Okay, it's now, for decades, we've been telling people, go to college, get a degree, move ahead, get your master's, move up. And that has been roughly true for a good portion of history. In the last 10 years, that model has begun to break down. College educations have gotten more expensive. They've been less focused and less, quite frankly, useful to the economics of most businesses. And so while I don't ever object to anyone deepening education on any level, it's a beautiful thing, right? It's not necessarily economic. And what I see happening here with, again, we talk about this ubiquitous connectivity. We're connected all the time, everywhere. We have edge compute now capable of supporting cognitive companions, our own little digital agent that travels with us, right? And this idea that maybe lives on a wearable with us. And then you add the AI in the background in the cloud. Well, suddenly all those things come together to solve a really big demographic problem. Training people, there's not enough workers, blue collar workers, and there's 2 billion deskless workers in the world right now, approximately. It solves a problem. There's not enough of those folks to do all the plumbing, HVAC work, construction, building data centers, whatever you have. There's not enough of those folks. So this system, and forget about oil and gas operations, other places where you have to onboard people. So now you have a way to, using these tools, to bring people up to speed quicker, to learn faster, right? Democratizes education in a way that's been unprecedented, allows them to function and get access to information and real-time support, and then be able to move forward. So I think that you're going to see this recognition of this blue-collar renaissance where, now it's about what you can do and where value is added, and it's not just going to be, knowledge used to be restricted to that boardroom, that executive suite. Well, now you know what, that first on the floor, if you've got a great system in place, people, systems, discipline, if you've got that system in place, they can have the same access to information that you have, and they can make decisions faster because they're in touch with the customer and the process. and you will be a better company for it.
Yeah, I think that's so insightful. I really appreciate that perspective.
Thank you. Again, it's like I'm one of 20 podcasts or so on the Oil and Gas Global Network. You can check us out at oggn.com/connected-worker. Don't forget the hyphen there. And you can learn all about a number of the topics we've talked about today, where I've gone a little bit deeper with some really great industry leaders.
Yeah, and I have to highly recommend your podcast. I think it's very knowledgeable, and it's a great way to dig into some of these topics a lot deeper.
Well, thanks, John. Well, I think I just like to make sure everyone understands that as things are changing faster and faster, and technology is accelerating at a rate we've never seen before, right? You take a look at what AI is capable of, and it's really doubling every 6 months or so of what we think we can do. So the normal time of which you can, sit back and assess is getting disrupted, because it's already what you're evaluating is not what it's capable of doing today. What I think is important, a message I would give to every young person, every executive, every manager starting out, is that success is going to be more about being more human and doing the things human beings do better than anything else. That means creativity, innovation, ideation, empathy. These are the things that are going to distinguish you in your career. And you'll be good at using AI tools to help make the rest of the stuff happen. But it's going to be less of a focus on, understanding all the answers and the nuances, because there's now too much for any expert to know. But it's going to be really important to be a great people person and to help those people have good systems and have the discipline to use them to develop, better, more productive systems and safer systems for workers.
That's fantastic. I completely agree with you. I think that's one of the key elements. And well, Andrew, I have to admit, this has been such a fantastic conversation with you, and have just thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm excited for folks to tune into your podcast as well. So we'll make sure that is in the feed, like you mentioned, or in the show notes, and then we'll go ahead and follow up from there.
Great, John. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for the invitation, and let's do it again sometime in the near future.
Excellent. I can't wait. Have a great day.
Take care.